Hours before demonstrators were set to protest President Donald Trump and his administration at the Texas state capitol, state law enforcement evacuated the building and its surrounding grounds over what they called a credible threat to state lawmakers. This week on Inside the Investigation, KXAN Investigators explain what happened at the protests over the weekend and why Texas law enforcement is on heightened alert. Hello there, welcome to Inside the Investigation. I'm your host for this week, Christopher Adams. But never fear, our regular host, Kelly Wiley, is here in the studio with me. Kelly, you're usually the one asking the questions here, but today you'll be answering some about your own reporting.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
All right, so let's get straight into it. We are talking this week about the No Kings protests that we saw at cities across the country, including here in Austin over the weekend. Now, demonstrators were rallying against President Trump and his administration's methods to increase the number of undocumented people being deported. And Kelly, like we said, one of these protests was here in Austin.
Yeah, this group, Hands Off Central Texas, was one of the main organizers behind the protests in Austin. The organization secured Texas State Representative Jean Wu as a sponsor for the protest, which allowed them to hold it on Capitol grounds. They had a pretty impressive lineup of elected officials set to speak. U.S. Congressman Greg Casar, U.S. Congressman Lloyd Doggett, and State Senator Sarah Eckhart, who was scheduled to close the whole event out. In the days leading up to the protest, the primary concern was Governor Abbott's decision to put the Texas National Guard on standby.
Texas is a law and order state.
The governor said he wanted the Texas National Guard, if things got out of control, to assist local and state law enforcement.
We will use every tool that we can to ensure order across our state.
But then on Saturday, there was a larger concern. Hours before the protest was set to begin, a letter began circulating online. According to our sources, Texas State Representative Charlie Guerin shared a message that effectively said the Texas Department of Public Safety identified a credible threat towards state legislators who were set to go to Saturday's protest. We learned that due to this threat, around 1 p.m, DPS evacuated the Capitol and its ground. And Christopher, at that point, the protest had not been canceled, but there was a question of whether it would take place.
Well, let's pause here because there's some wider context that we need to bring in. This was happening on the same day as the shooting up in Minnesota that we have all heard about by now. A man who police there say was impersonating an officer shot and killed a state representative, Melissa Hortman, and her husband, Mark, inside their own home. Also, Minnesota State Senator John Hoffman and his wife Yvette also seriously injured in a separate shooting at their home. So while new details are coming out about this shooting up in Minnesota, here we are in Texas with news of this threat coming out here.
Right, and that correlation to that fatal Minnesota shooting was brought up and referenced in that letter. At the point that the message was sent, the shooter in Minnesota was not in police custody. And in the message, state officials said they were concerned about copycats and those who the attack in Minnesota might inspire.
All right, so let's get back to the protest in Austin. It was supposed to start around 5 o'clock that evening on Saturday. There's news of this threat at the Capitol floating around. What happens next?
Well, maybe 30 minutes before the protest, DPS announces they have someone in custody in connection with this threat. The Capitol grounds reopened. One of the first speakers is probably the most high-profile politician there, Congressman Lloyd Doggett.
And we know that after the rally at the Capitol ended, a large group of demonstrators then marched from the Capitol building to the J.J. Pickle Federal Building, which is just a few blocks away. But it's important to mention that building because the J.J. Pickle, because as we've reported in the past, it has been used by ICE and is being used by ICE as a temporary holding facility for detainees. Now, KXAN's Grace Reader was reporting live from the protest on Saturday night. Here's a little bit of what she was seeing.
We have seen a couple folks here and there be detained by law enforcement for not moving off of the sidewalk when they are told or out of the street when they are told. But we are now seeing this group of protesters start to actually walk again. It's unclear where they're going, but they're going south on San Jacinto. We're at San Jacinto and 8th Street.
And you hear Grace say she wasn't quite sure where they were going at the time that she did this live shot, but those protesters ended up walking towards I-35, a major highway in Austin. The next day, the Austin Police Department said, except for a small number of agitators, the protest was largely peaceful. Notably, the Texas National Guard was not deployed.
So much calmer than the protests that we saw in Austin less than a week before on Monday when DPS had to deploy CS gas. The Austin Police Department used pepper balls to try and break up the crowds. Things were much calmer during this protest on Saturday. All right, so this new protest is happening despite this credible threat being reported at the Capitol. Kelly, what do we know about the man who DPS arrested in connection to that threat?
Well, in the days following the protest, DPS officials did not release the name of the person they said they arrested in connection with this identified threat. Still, we learned through several sources that DPS arrested 45-year-old Robert Leroy Bowers of Katy, Texas. Our team obtained an arrest report that shows DPS troopers arrested Bowers during a traffic stop on State Highway 71 in LaGrange, a little more than 50 miles away from the Capitol. According to the report, he did not have a front license plate on his car and he was speeding when they stopped him.
And what time was this traffic stop?
This was around 1:41 in the afternoon.
So really not long after the Capitol grounds are evacuated.
Exactly.
And so how did DPS describe their interaction with Bowers during this traffic stop?
According to the trooper, Bowers said he was heading to a protest, and he told the trooper he wanted to participate peacefully. The trooper noted that Bowers was with his wife at the time. The trooper also described what Bowers was wearing: black pants, knee pads, and heavy-duty boots. Bowers also told the trooper he had a 9mm handgun in his car. But then the report starts talking about some information DPS obtained that Bowers had allegedly sent messages to a friend that were interpreted as wishing to inflict harm on state elected officials and politicians in Austin. The trooper said he ultimately placed Bowers under arrest for that traffic violation and out of an abundance of caution.
So you mentioned these messages that he allegedly sent to a friend. Do we know what was in those messages?
No, we don't. And we've been asking DPS, but so far we've not received a response.
All right, so this is all happening about a week ago on Saturday afternoon. Where do things stand now?
So it's almost been a week since DPS arrested Bowers, and he's still not been charged with the crime related to this threat. And aside from the arrest report, DPS has actually not directly addressed Bowers by name in any of its communication about this threat. DPS informed us that there is still an active investigation despite no charges having been filed. KPRC in Houston also got video showing DPS searching his home, but Bowers was released from the Fayette County Jail on Monday on his own recognizance. And on Tuesday night, an ABC station in Houston talked to him.
What did he say?
Well, he told the reporter that since this threat has become public knowledge, his life has been turned upside down. He told the reporter he said nothing and that somebody has a vendetta against him.
Okay, so this is obviously still an ongoing investigation. As you mentioned, no charges have been filed against Bowers at this point connected to the threat itself. But of course, this is not happening in a vacuum. Like we mentioned, this was the same day as the deadly shooting in Minnesota. How did this, talk to us about how this alleged threat caught the attention of lawmakers here in Texas?
Well, it definitely caught their attention. The House Democratic Caucus actually wrote a letter to Governor Abbott asking for next steps for protecting legislators and for monitoring political extremism. Governor Abbott addressed this at a press conference on Monday where he said DPS is on heightened alert.
Information both through social media sources as well as other sources to make sure they will have the most robust source of information and be able to address this in advance. I've seen them do it hundreds of times, so that they're very effective at it. And they will work to ensure that not just members of the legislature, but candidly anybody in the public is going to be free from some type of deranged attack like that.
And there are a lot of questions that we have specifically about this alleged threat and what will happen to Bowers. But I think more broadly, there are a lot of questions too about how political intimidation and violence in the country impacts these lawmakers and the public overall, and what level of safety elected officials are going to have moving forward.
Definitely some ongoing conversations in a climate that we all know is very highly charged right now. Kelly, Wiley, thank you so much for joining me. And thank you for listening to this episode of Inside the Investigation. We release a new episode every Friday morning on the KXAN Investigates podcast. You can also watch us on the KXAN Plus app, which is available on Apple TV, Amazon Fire TV, and Roku. I'm Christopher Adams. We'll see you next time.